less scarce, even though population of the world continued to increase. Therefore, in 1980, he made a bet with Paul Ehrlich. And the bet was on the price of 5 commodities. Let me see if I can remember them. The bet was on the price of chromium, copper, nickel, tin, and tungsten. And the deal was as such. If over the next 10 years, between 1980 and 1990, the price of these 5 metals became more expensive, they became scarcer, Simon would pay Ehrlich. But if they became cheaper, then Ehrlich would pay Simon. Well, the bet came to an end in 1990, September 29th, 1990, and the inflation-adjusted price of these 5 metals dropped by 36% in spite of the fact that the population of the world rose by almost 1 billion.
And in spite of the fact that they both agreed that that would be the basket they would bet on.
Actually, Ehrlich picked the basket. Yes, Simon was generous enough. He said, Paul Ehrlich, pick any 5 commodities or any 5 commodities you want, and those were the ones that Ehrlich picked.
Well, what's so interesting about that, I think, well, there's many, many things that are interesting about it, but one of the things that's so interesting is that you might infer from that in order to put your notion forward as a scientific hypothesis, you actually have to bind it with a time frame. You can't just say, well, at some point in the future, the population is going to expand to the point where we consume all our resources. It's like, well, what do you mean? You mean a year, 10 years, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 150,000, a million? You mean you get to have the whole time frame for you to be right? Or no, are you accurate enough in your knowledge so that you can actually pin it down, let's say within a decade or something, some reasonable fraction of a human life at least? And so, because I mean, the biologists who, when they responded to that bet, because it was quite the cultural moment in some sense that Simon won, the rejoinder from the environmentalist doom types was, well, we were off by a few decades and that's why we lost. It isn't that we're wrong. It's just that these things are complex and our time frame was wrong. It's like, yeah, if your time frame's wrong, then your theory's wrong. And if you can't place a time frame around it, then your theory is so weak that you should just be quiet about it. And I think the same thing applies to all this climate doom as well. It's like, specify it. Well, we can't. It's too complex. Well, then quit terrifying everyone.
You know, another thing that was interesting about it is, you know, as professors, we get to say all kinds of things and never be really held accountable for it. And so putting money on the table, you know, also added this really interesting dimension to it. Is not only is it framed in time, it's framed with a bet. So got to hold this guy accountable for his claim.
Some skin in the game. Well, and then there was a reputational issue too, right? Because it was a very public bet. And it wasn't so famous when they first made it, but by the time it came around for the bet to be settled, and I would say this is particularly true of Julian Simon, who we should talk about for a moment. Paul Ehrlich's a pretty smart biologist, but Julian Simon was a genius. And so that's useful for people to know too. I mean, he was a truly outstanding mind. And for him to be optimistic in the face of what was almost a universal pessimism in the late 60s and early 70s around, well, the possibility of nuclear war and certainly the possibility of overpopulation and I mean, it just and environmental degradation and all of that was that apocalyptic vision was what everyone who paraded themselves as informed and, you know, properly skeptically pessimistic, they were all parading that as a moral virtue. And for Simon to come out and say, no, you guys just, it's like Elon Musk now coming out and talking about how, you know, one of the biggest problems that's going to beset us in the next 100 years is depopulation, which I happen to believe is true. I also think he's dead on with his criticisms about the UN's population predictions. I think the UN predictions there's no evidence they're accurate at all. And even if they are, we can handle the 9 to 10 billion people that we'll probably peak out at.
The United Nations has been historically quite their numbers have not stood the test of time. There are other demographers in the world who have done a better job at predicting where the world population is going to be. And the latest bit on this is in Lancet, which predicts that by the year 2100, we are either going to have 9 billion people in the world, we are currently on 8, or 7 billion people in the world. So, it's perfectly possible that at the end of this century, there will be as many people in the world as there are now. Obviously, the further out in the future you go, the less clear those predictions are. But there's another thing that I wanted to mention about Julian Simon, because you expressed an interest in learning a little more about him. It wasn't just that he was right, but he was facing a lot of personal invective from the great and the good. He was regularly called an idiot and a fool who didn't know what. Ehrlich famously said that to explain biology to Simon was like trying to explain the oil market to a cranberry. All sorts of other things. Ehrlich continued to receive throughout his life a variety of very prestigious academic prizes. Only recently he was invited to Vatican of all places, to give a talk on the danger of overpopulation. That was like 3 years ago. So in spite of being wrong,
you don't want to have too many souls to save.
So in spite of being wrong all the time, he just keeps on being highly revered. There's one more thing I do want to say, and then I think I will hand it to Gail, because Gail will do a good job of explaining why we thought that we could improve on the bet. But the key that I wanted to talk about is that in spite of the fact that Ehrlich lost this very visible and very humiliating wager with Simon, the idea of overpopulation never went anywhere. Yes, environmental movement is incredibly complex. There are people who are extremely smart and well-intentioned, like, for example, Lomborg or Steven Pinker. They mean well. They are interested in technological solutions to climate problems, and I count myself in that kind of sort of universe. But there is an extremist environmentalist subtext or subgroup in environmentalism who have these apocalyptic obsessions. So, for example, and this gets translated into the movies which billions of people see around the world. In our book, we talk about how with every decade since the 1950s, the number of apocalyptic movies has been actually increasing, which is the exact opposite of what is happening on Earth. The Earth is getting richer, healthier. In some ways, there is even environmental improvement, but there are more and more movies about how the world is going to end in some sort of a catastrophic apocalypse. And one of them is a very, very famous one, and that was the